The late afternoon sun filtered through the mullioned windows of Arabella Hartley's guest chambers, painting golden squares across the Persian carpet as her aunt, Dowager Duchess Margaret Hartley, fastened the final clasp of her emerald earrings. Arabella's reflection stared back at her from the oval mirror of her French penteadera, a young woman whose green eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement, whose porcelain cheeks flushed with the anticipation of a dream about to come true. "You look like your mother did at her first court ball," Margaret said softly, her weathered hands gentle as they adjusted a loose tendril of Arabella's chocolate-brown hair. The elaborate updo had taken her lady's maid 2 hours to perfect, weaving silver ribbons through the waves that cascaded in carefully orchestrated curls. She had that same light in her eyes, that same dangerous hope. Arabella turned from the mirror, the midnight blue silk of her gown whispering across the hardwood floor. The dress was her finest, commissioned specifically for tonight's royal masquerade ball, its off-shoulder neckline modest yet elegant, the empire waist emphasizing her slender figure, before the skirt flowed in 3 layers of tulle and Belgian lace. Silver thread embroidery caught the light with every movement, creating the illusion of starlight clinging to fabric. "How dangerous," Arabella laughed, the sound bright and young in the quiet chamber. "Aunt Margaret, you make hope sound like a sin." The older woman's green-grey eyes, so much like Arabella's own, yet dimmed by decades of court intrigue, studied her niece with an expression that mingled affection and worry. Margaret's grey-silver hair was pulled into an impeccable chignon, her lavender gown speaking of refined widowhood and hard-won wisdom. She moved to the window, her gloved hands clasping the ivory handle of her ever-present fan. "In this court, my dear, hope often is." Margaret's voice carried the weight of experience. "You must understand what you're walking into tonight. The royal masquerade is not simply a ball, it's a hunting ground where ambitions wear silk and betrayals hide behind Venetian masks." Arabella joined her aunt at the window, looking down at the sprawling gardens of Ashford Royal Palace. Even from 3 stories up, she could see servants hanging the last of the Venetian lanterns, their smoked glass catching the fading daylight. The white marble fountain at the garden's heart stood like a promise, water already dancing in its 3 tiers, the statue of Venus at its summit, seeming to smile knowingly at the spring sky. "I'm not naive, Aunt," Arabella said, though even she could hear the defensiveness in her tone. "I know the court can be cruel. But surely you don't think every person there is a schemer. Surely some of them might actually be kind, genuine." Margaret turned to face her, and something in her expression made Arabella's breath catch. It was the look of someone about to deliver a truth they wished they could spare you from knowing. "My darling girl, listen to me carefully. You are 21 years old, beautiful, accomplished, and from a respectable if modest family. You have no fortune to speak of, no political connections that matter, no dowry that would make a titled gentleman look twice." Margaret's words were gentle but relentless. "The only reason we received an invitation to tonight's ball is because your late father once saved King Edmund's life during a riding accident 20 years ago. The Crown remembers its debts, and this invitation is payment. Nothing more." The words should have stung, but Arabella felt her chin lift with a stubbornness her aunt knew all too well. "Then I'll make them look twice for other reasons. I'll make them see that worth isn't measured only in gold or connections." "And therein lies the danger," Margaret whispered, reaching out to cup Arabella's face with one gloved hand. "You still believe in fairy tales, my dear. You still think that goodness is rewarded, that virtue is recognized, that a prince might fall in love with a girl simply because she's deserving of love." Arabella pulled back, confusion creasing her brow. "Are you telling me not to hope, not to dream? What else am I supposed to do?" "I'm telling you to be careful." Margaret's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "I'm telling you that Prince Alexander Ashford is 23 years old, devastatingly handsome, and has had every eligible woman in England throwing themselves at his feet since he turned 18. He is charming, well-mannered, and utterly empty of anything resembling genuine emotion. He collects hearts the way other men collect hunting trophies." The name alone sent a flutter through Arabella's chest. Prince Alexander. She'd seen him only once before, 3 months ago at a garden party, and even from across a crowded lawn, his golden hair and crystal blue eyes had seemed to belong to someone from a storybook. He'd smiled at her, just once, just briefly, and she'd carried that smile in her memory like a talisman ever since. "You don't know that he's empty," Arabella protested. "You've never even spoken to him." "No, but I've watched him for years. I've seen the parade of young women who thought they would be different, special, the one to finally capture his heart." Margaret's expression turned sad. "And I've watched every single one of them learn the same bitter lesson. The prince is a mirage, Arabella. Beautiful, untouchable, and ultimately as substantial as morning mist." A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret's lady's maid entered with Arabella's silver Venetian mask, its delicate surface adorned with pearls and white plumes. The sight of it sent a thrill down Arabella's spine. Tonight. Tonight everything would change. She could feel it in the spring air, in the way her heart hammered against her ribs, in the certainty that somehow, impossibly, fate was conspiring in her favor. "It's time," the maid said softly. Margaret sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Then there's nothing more I can say except this. Guard your heart, Arabella. Guard it as you would guard your very life. Because in that ballroom tonight, there will be people who would destroy it for sport, for advancement, or simply because they can." Arabella took her aunt's hand, squeezing gently. "I promise I'll be careful, but I also promise not to hide. If there's even a chance that something magical might happen tonight, I'm going to be brave enough to meet it." As they left the chamber and descended the grand staircase toward the sounds of arriving carriages and the distant strains of an orchestra tuning their instruments, Arabella couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove. Something magical would indeed happen that night. But magic, as every old story knew, always came with a price. The royal ballroom of Ashford Palace was a vision conjured from dreams and candlelight. Arabella paused at the top of the entrance stairs, her hand resting lightly on the marble balustrade, and simply stared. She'd heard descriptions of the room's grandeur, but no words could have prepared her for the reality. The space stretched 40 meters in length and 25 in width, its vaulted ceiling soaring 12 meters overhead. 3 massive Venetian crystal chandeliers hung like frozen cascades of light, each holding 200 candles that filled the air with the scent of beeswax and warmth. The flames reflected endlessly in the enormous Venetian mirrors lining the walls, creating the illusion that the ballroom extended into infinity, that hundreds upon hundreds of masked guests swirled through countless parallel dimensions. The floor beneath was a masterwork of black and white marble, set in a diagonal checkerboard pattern, polished to such brilliance that it too reflected the candlelight, turning the dancers into beings of light and shadow. The walls themselves were cream marble with veins of gold running through them, like rivers of liquid metal, divided by white Corinthian pilasters that rose to meet the gilded moldings of the ceiling. Between the columns, panels of navy blue and gold damask covered the walls, their surfaces shimmering with the movement of air stirred by 800 bodies in motion. At the far end of the room, upon a raised dais draped in burgundy velvet, the royal throne stood empty. King Edmund Ashford had not yet made his entrance, and by tradition no one would be formally announced until the king himself blessed the evening with his presence. Until then, the ball existed in a state of delicious anticipation, the guests mingling and dancing in a carefully choreographed performance of aristocratic grace. Arabella descended the stairs slowly, aware of eyes turning toward her, despite the anonymity supposedly provided by the masks. Hers was silver with pearls and white plumes, elegant but not ostentatious. Around her, other women wore masks adorned with diamonds, sapphires, rubies worked into elaborate designs. Men in black and gold and burgundy velvet moved through the crowd like pieces on a chessboard, their identities hidden behind leather and silk constructions that transformed them into mysterious strangers. "Lady Hartley," a male voice spoke at her elbow, cultured and smooth. Arabella turned to find a man in a deep blue tailcoat with silver embroidery, his mask a simple affair of blue silk that left his mouth visible. His lips curved in a practiced smile. "Would you honor me with this dance?" She didn't recognize him, couldn't place him, but court etiquette demanded grace. "Of course, my lord." He led her onto the floor as the orchestra swung into a waltz. His hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety, his other hand holding hers with just the right amount of pressure. They began to move, and Arabella was grateful for the countless hours her aunt had made her practice with a dancing master. "To your first royal ball?" the man asked, making conversation over the music. "Is it so obvious?" Arabella replied, trying for lightness even as her eyes scanned the room. Where was Prince Alexander? Would she recognize him behind a mask? Only in the most charming way. You look at everything with wonder. Most of us have forgotten how to see the magic here. There was something almost sad in his voice. We've seen it too many times, until the gold looks like brass and the crystal like glass. The dance swept them past a cluster of women in magnificent gowns, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. As Arabella passed, she caught fragments of their words. Heard she hasn't a penny to her name. Invitation was charity, pure and simple. Dreaming if she thinks she has any chance. Heat flooded Arabella's cheeks, but she kept her smile fixed, kept her steps light and sure. Her partner noticed, his hand tightening fractionally at her waist. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. "Court vultures always circle fresh blood. They're testing you, seeing if you'll break." "I won't," Arabella said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm stronger than I look." "I believe you are." The waltz was ending, the music resolving into final chords. As he bowed over her hand, the man said, "A word of advice, if I may. In this court, masks hide more than faces. The most dangerous people are often the ones who seem the kindest. Trust your instincts, not your hopes." Before Arabella could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. She stood alone for a moment, disoriented by the swirl of colors and masks and whispered cruelties. Then a footman appeared at her elbow with a tray of crystal glasses filled with champagne. She took one gratefully, the cool bubbles a relief against her suddenly dry throat. Well, well, if it isn't the charity case. The voice was female, cultured, and dripping with venom. Arabella turned to find a woman in a gown of deep purple, so dark it was nearly black, with red accents that seemed to pulse like fresh wounds in the candlelight. Her mask was elaborate, crafted from black lace, and decorated with what looked like genuine rubies. Through the eyeholes, dark eyes studied Arabella with unconcealed contempt. "I beg your pardon?" Arabella said, keeping her voice level, despite the rapid acceleration of her heartbeat. "Lady Cordelia Ravenscroft," the woman said, executing a curtsy that somehow managed to be both technically perfect and deeply insulting. "I assume you know who I am, even if I had to be informed of your pedigree." Arabella did know. Lady Cordelia was 28, wealthy, beautiful in a sharp-edged way, and ruthlessly ambitious. She'd been pursuing the king's attention for over a year, ever since Queen Catherine had died of scarlet fever. The gossip said she'd already mentally fitted herself for a crown. "Lady Ravenscroft," Arabella replied with a curtsy of her own. "A pleasure." "Oh, I doubt that." Cordelia's red lips curved into something that might have been a smile on someone with warmth in their veins. "But let's dispense with the pleasantries, shall we? I know why you're here. Every girl like you is here for the same reason. You think that because you have a pretty face and a tragic story, you might catch the eye of someone important, perhaps even the prince himself." The accuracy of the assessment stole Arabella's breath for a moment. But she recovered, lifting her chin. "I'm here because I was invited, just like you." "No, darling, not just like me." Cordelia's voice dropped to a purr that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "I was invited because I'm the Duke of Ravenscroft's daughter, because I bring wealth and connections and power to any alliance. You were invited out of pity, out of obligation to a dead man who once kept the king from breaking his neck. Don't confuse charity with opportunity." Each word was a carefully placed blade, designed to cut deep. Arabella felt them land, felt the sting and the doubt they inspired, but she also felt something else rising in her chest. Anger, pride, a stubborn refusal to be dismissed. "Thank you for clarifying my position," Arabella said quietly. "It's always helpful to know where one stands." "Oh, I haven't finished." Cordelia leaned closer, her perfume cloying and too sweet. Here's some free advice from someone who actually belongs here. Whatever fantasies you're nurturing about Prince Alexander, let them go now. He dances with girls like you for the same reason he feeds sugar cubes to his horse. It amuses him for a moment, and then he forgets you exist. Don't embarrass yourself by believing otherwise. Before Arabella could formulate a response, a ripple of movement swept through the ballroom. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Dancers froze in place. Every head turned toward the main entrance where footmen in royal livery were pulling open the massive double doors. His Majesty, King Edmund Ashford, the herald's voice rang out. Prince Alexander Ashford. They entered together, father and son, and the contrast between them was striking. Prince Alexander was exactly as Arabella remembered, perhaps even more beautiful in his royal blue tailcoat with silver embroidery, his golden hair catching the candlelight like a halo. His smile was radiant, easy, the smile of someone who had never known a moment's doubt or hardship. He wore a simple domino mask of blue silk that somehow only enhanced his crystalline blue eyes. But it was the king who commanded the room's attention, who seemed to draw all the light and air toward himself, with the sheer force of his presence. King Edmund Ashford was 42 years old, though he carried those years with an athleticism that spoke of hours in the saddle and the practice yard. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders broad beneath a tailcoat of black velvet, embroidered with gold thread, so fine it seemed to glow. His vest was dark gold brocade, his cravat white silk tied in a perfect mathematical, his black breeches and boots polished to a mirror shine. A burgundy velvet cape lined with silk flowed from his shoulders, and over his features he wore a black Venetian mask, trimmed with aged gold. But the mask couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw, the aristocratic nose, the mouth that seemed designed for both commands and kisses. His hair was dark brown, shot through with silver at the temples, swept back in a style that emphasized his striking face. A short, immaculately groomed beard and goatee framed his mouth, the facial hair also showing that intriguing mixture of brown and silver that spoke of maturity rather than age. What struck Arabella most forcefully, however, were his eyes. Even from across the vast ballroom, even behind the mask, she could see their color, a storm gray with undertones of steel blue. And in those eyes was something that made her breath catch in her throat. Loneliness. Bone-deep, soul-weary loneliness that no amount of power or wealth or adulation could ease. King Edmund and Prince Alexander made their way to the dais, ascending to their thrones as the court bowed and curtsied in waves of rustling silk. The king sat with a fluid grace that suggested strength held carefully in check. He surveyed the room with those grey-blue eyes, and Arabella couldn't help but feel he was seeing not a ballroom full of guests, but a chessboard full of pieces he'd learned long ago not to trust. "Let the festivities begin," the king said, his voice deep and carrying effortlessly across the space. It was a beautiful voice, rich with authority, but also with something else, something that sounded almost like weariness. "Dance. Enjoy this evening." Sometimes it's important to remember that beneath our titles and our duties, we are simply people seeking connection in a world too often filled with loneliness. It was an odd thing for a king to say at a ball, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. But then the orchestra launched into another waltz, and the spell was broken. The court returned to its carefully choreographed performance of gaiety. "How strange," Arabella murmured, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until Cordelia laughed beside her. "You find the king strange? How perceptive." Cordelia's voice dripped sarcasm. "Everyone knows Edmund has been half mad with grief since Catherine died. He barely attends court functions anymore. The fact that he's here tonight at all is remarkable. Of course, everyone also knows he needs to remarry soon. The succession requires it, and Alexander is still unmarried himself. The king needs to set an example." Arabella watched as Prince Alexander descended from the dais and immediately offered his hand to a stunning blonde in a gown of pale gold. They moved onto the floor, and the prince's laughter rang out, charming and utterly carefree. "Shouldn't you be positioning yourself for the king's attention, then?" Arabella asked Cordelia, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "If he's so desperate to remarry?" Cordelia's dark eyes glittered with something dangerous. "Oh, I will be. But unlike you, I know how to play the long game. I don't rush in with childish dreams. I strategize. I plan. I win." She swept away in a rustle of purple and red, leaving Arabella standing alone once more. The evening had barely begun, and already she felt exhausted from navigating the treacherous undercurrents of court politics. Margaret had been right. This was no fairy tale. This was a battlefield where the weapons were words, and the wounds were invisible but no less real for that. Arabella moved toward the edge of the ballroom, seeking a moment of respite near one of the tall windows. Outside, night had fallen completely, and she could see the gardens lit by those Venetian lanterns she'd noticed earlier. The light looked magical, golden and welcoming, so different from the harsh glitter of the ballroom. She was so absorbed in the view that she didn't notice the figure approaching until a voice spoke beside her. "Hiding already? The ball's only just begun." Arabella turned to find a man in a black velvet tailcoat with gold embroidery, a black Venetian mask obscuring most of his features. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and something about his presence made the air feel charged with electricity. His eyes, visible through the mask, were that same storm grey she'd noticed across the room. The king. She sank into a deep curtsy, her heart suddenly thundering. "Your Majesty, forgive me, I didn't mean to seem ungrateful for the invitation." "Rise, please." His voice was even more compelling up close, that deep richness seeming to resonate in her very bones. When she stood, he was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You're the Hartley girl, James Hartley's daughter. You remember my father?" Arabella's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I remember the man who saved my life when I was 22, and stupid enough to take a jump my horse had better sense than to attempt." Something that might have been a smile touched his visible mouth. "He pulled me from beneath that horse and kept me from bleeding to death until the physicians arrived. I owed him a debt I could never repay. When I learned he'd died and left a daughter, the least I could do was ensure you were welcomed at court." So Cordelia had been right. The invitation was charity, pure and simple. The knowledge should have stung, but somehow hearing it from the king himself, spoken in that voice of quiet sincerity, it felt different, less like pity and more like honor. "My father spoke of you often," Arabella said softly. "He considered saving you one of the proudest moments of his life, not because you were a prince at the time, but because he said he'd never met anyone with more courage or more integrity." She watched something shift in those grey-blue eyes, surprise perhaps, or maybe something deeper. The king was silent for a long moment, and Arabella suddenly became aware of how closely they were standing, how the rest of the ballroom seemed to have faded into a blur of color and sound. "Your father was a remarkable judge of character," the king finally said. His voice had dropped lower, more intimate. "Tell me, Lady Arabella, are you enjoying your first royal ball, or has the court already shown you its claws?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She could lie, could offer the expected platitudes about what an honor it all was. But something in those lonely eyes made her want to be truthful. "Both," she admitted. "The ballroom is more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. But yes, I've already learned that not everyone is pleased by my presence here. Let me guess. Lady Cordelia Ravenscroft has already explained precisely how little you matter and how foolish you'd be to dream above your station." Arabella's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Because Cordelia does the same to every woman she perceives as potential competition. She's so focused on her campaign to become queen that she's forgotten how to simply be human." He paused, then added with something that might have been humor, "Also, I saw her corner you, and her body language was aggressive enough to be visible from across the room." Despite everything, Arabella found herself smiling. "She's very direct. She's very ambitious. There's a difference." The king's gaze moved past her to the window, to the gardens beyond. "Would you walk with me, Lady Arabella? I find I'm suffocating in here, and the gardens look particularly beautiful tonight." Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that accepting such an invitation was dangerous. Kings didn't ask minor noblewomen to walk in gardens. This could only end in scandal or heartbreak or both. But she looked into those storm-grey eyes, and saw in them the same thing she'd seen in her own reflection earlier that evening. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, absolutely irresistible hope. "I would be honored, Your Majesty," she heard herself say. He offered his arm and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him through the velvet of his coat. As they moved toward the doors that led to the garden terrace, Arabella was dimly aware of heads turning, of whispers starting, of Cordelia's dark gaze burning into her back. But then they were outside, stepping into air perfumed with jasmine and honeysuckle, and the noise of the ballroom faded behind them. The garden stretched before them, lit by 50 or more Venetian lanterns that cast pools of golden light along the white gravel pathways. The fountain at the garden's heart sparkled with reflected light, and above it all a full moon hung in the spring sky like a silver coin. "Better," the king said, and she realized he'd released a breath he'd been holding. Much better. They began to walk, following one of the geometric pathways between perfectly trimmed hedges of boxwood. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel, a sound that seemed loud in the relative quiet. Arabella was intensely aware of his presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from him despite the cool spring air, of the way his hand covered hers where it rested in the crook of his arm. "May I ask you something?" she ventured after they'd walked in silence for several moments. "You may ask anything you wish. I reserve the right to answer or not as I see fit." "Fair enough. Why are you really here tonight? Lady Cordelia said you rarely attend court functions anymore." She felt him stiffen slightly beside her, but he didn't pull away. "Cordelia talks too much, but she's not entirely wrong. I find most court functions tedious exercises in false courtesy and political maneuvering. Tonight, however, my council insisted I had to make an appearance. They're concerned about the succession, about stability, about 100 things that boil down to one essential fact." "What fact is that?" "That I'm expected to remarry soon, produce more heirs, secure the dynasty." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Never mind that I buried my wife only 3 years ago. Never mind that the thought of replacing her feels like a betrayal. The crown requires it, therefore I must comply." Arabella heard the bitterness in his words, the bone-deep weariness. Without thinking, she squeezed his arm gently. "That sounds like a terrible burden." "It is." They had reached the fountain, its waters dancing in 3 tiers, the statue of Venus on top seeming to watch them with knowing eyes. The king stopped, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight and lamplight, his mask looked like something from a dream, mysterious and compelling. "But you didn't come to a ball to hear a widower complain about his obligations. Tell me about yourself, Lady Arabella. Who are you when you're not navigating the treacheries of court?" So she told him. Standing there beside the fountain with water singing and moonlight silver on the gravel paths, she told him about growing up in her father's modest estate in Somerset, about riding through fields in the morning mist, about reading poetry in the library while rain drummed on the windows. She told him about her mother's death when she was 12, about her father raising her alone until his own death 2 years ago, about going to live with Aunt Margaret, and learning the hard way that the world was far less kind than she'd been raised to believe. And he listened, not with the polite half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered in that moment. "I still believe in goodness," he said when she'd finished. It wasn't a question. "Despite everything you've lost, everything you've learned about how cruel people can be, you still think the world might be a place where kindness matters." "Is that so foolish?" she asked, suddenly defensive. "No." His hand reached up, and she felt his fingers brush her cheek with a tenderness that stole her breath. "It's extraordinary. It's the rarest thing I've encountered in 20 years of ruling this country. Don't let the court take that from you, Arabella. Don't let them make you cynical." The use of her first name, without title or formality, sent a shiver down her spine. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the texture of his mask, the way the gold trim caught the light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Really? Without the crown and the title and the expectations?" "I don't know anymore," he admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice made her heart clench. "I've been king for so long that I've forgotten how to be anything else. Husband, father, friend. I've failed at all of them because I could only ever be a king first. But standing here with you, I remember something I'd forgotten. What's that? What it feels like to simply be a man. His hand cupped her face now, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. To want something not because it's politically expedient or dynastically necessary, but because it makes me feel alive for the first time in years. Arabella's heart was thundering so hard, she thought surely he must be able to hear it. This was madness. This was impossibility. This was everything she'd ever dreamed of, and nothing like what she'd imagined at the same time. Your Majesty, she began, but he shook his head. Edmund, he said quietly. Here in this garden without an audience, just call me Edmund. Edmund. His name tasted like honey and danger on her tongue. We barely know each other. This is insane. He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. Reckless? Absolutely inappropriate for a king? I'm aware. I'm also aware that I don't care. For once in my life, I'm choosing what I want instead of what's expected. He was going to kiss her. She knew it in the way he was looking at her, in the way the air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to let him, consequences be damned. When his lips met hers, it was like lightning striking earth. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, his mouth moving against hers with a tenderness that belied his power. But then she responded, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his tailcoat, and the kiss deepened into something that stole rational thought. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and she could feel the solid strength of his body, the way his heart hammered against hers. The world narrowed to this moment, this man, this impossible perfect kiss that tasted of champagne and risk and something that might have been destiny. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his chest. Through the velvet and linen and skin, she could hear his heart still racing. You made me feel alive again, he whispered against her hair. Don't let that go. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the court says, remember that this was real. Tomorrow. The word was like cold water. Tomorrow there would be consequences. Tomorrow the whole court would know that she'd disappeared into the gardens with the king. Tomorrow her reputation would be in tatters. But tonight, held in his arms with moonlight painting the world silver and the fountain singing its eternal song, Arabella couldn't bring herself to care about tomorrow. I should go back inside, she said eventually, though she made no move to pull away. Before we're missed. Yes. But his arms didn't release her. Arabella, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. You've awakened something in me I thought was dead. Hope. The possibility that life might hold something other than duty and loss. I don't know what comes next. But I need you to know that whatever happens tonight mattered. You matter. She looked up at him, at the strong lines of his jaw visible below the mask, at eyes that held both loneliness and the first fragile stirrings of joy. And she made a decision that would change everything. I'm not afraid of tomorrow, she lied beautifully. I'm not afraid of what they'll say. If you want me in your life, Edmund, then I'm here. His eyes closed, and she saw something like pain cross his face. Then he kissed her again, harder this time, more desperately, as if trying to memorize the taste of her. When they finally parted and began the walk back toward the ballroom, Arabella's mind was spinning. She'd come to this ball hoping to catch the eye of Prince Alexander, to maybe experience a fairy tale romance with a golden-haired prince. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more complicated. She'd found a widowed king with storm-grey eyes and a loneliness that matched her own. And as they reached the terrace doors and he released her hand with visible reluctance, as she slipped back into the ballroom alone, while he waited a discreet interval before following, Arabella realized something that made her heart sink even as it soared. She was in love. Desperately, dangerously, absolutely in love. And she didn't even know for certain that it had been the king she'd kissed. Because in the moonlight and shadows, behind masks and whispered confessions, she'd seen only what she wanted to see. She'd felt only the connection, the passion, the impossible rightness of being in his arms. But what if she'd been wrong? What if it had been someone else? What if she'd created a fantasy as foolish as the one Cordelia had accused her of nurturing about Prince Alexander? She pushed through the crowd, barely seeing the faces around her, barely hearing the music. She found Aunt Margaret near the refreshment table, the older woman's eyes widening at Arabella's dishevelled appearance. "Where have you been?" Margaret hissed, pulling her niece into a corner. "You've been gone for nearly an hour. People are starting to talk." "I was in the garden," Arabella said faintly. "I needed air." "Alone?" Arabella met her aunt's gaze and saw understanding dawn in those experienced eyes. Margaret's face went pale. "Oh, my dear girl, what have you done?" "I don't know," Arabella whispered. "I honestly don't know." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Arabella danced when required, smiled when expected, and made polite conversation with people whose names she would never remember. But her mind was in the garden, reliving every moment, every word, every touch. She watched Prince Alexander charm his way through a dozen different dance partners, his golden beauty drawing admiring glances from every woman in the room. He never once looked her way. But the king, seated once more on his throne, his mask still in place, his expression unreadable, seemed to watch her constantly. Every time she glanced toward the dais, those storm-grey eyes were on her. Was it him? Had she really kissed the king? Or had her desperate need for romance, for connection, for something magical to happen, led her to see what she wanted to see? She wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. Tomorrow, King Edmund would make an announcement that would turn her world inside out. Tomorrow she would learn that fairy tales were dangerous things, and that the man she'd kissed in the garden was about to claim her in a way that would make Cordelia's threats seem like gentle warnings. Tomorrow Arabella Hartley would discover that the heart she'd given so freely had been claimed by a king, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be simple again. The morning sun had barely begun its climb over Ashford Palace when Arabella was awakened by urgent knocking at her chamber door. She sat up in bed, disoriented and still half lost in dreams of storm-grey eyes and kisses that tasted of champagne and moonlight. "My lady," her maid's voice came through the door, high with anxiety. "You must dress immediately. The king has called for a formal announcement in the throne room. All guests are required to attend." Arabella's heart began to race. An announcement. This morning, before most of the court had even risen. It was unusual, unprecedented even. But surely it had nothing to do with her. Surely the king wouldn't. No. She refused to let hope and fear tangle into knots in her chest. She would dress, she would attend, and she would face whatever came with the same courage her father had shown when he'd pulled a young prince from beneath a panicked horse. The maid helped her into a day dress of cream muslin with green velvet ribbons at the waist, far simpler than last night's ball gown, but elegant in its own way. Her hair was pinned up in a simple chignon, a few curls left loose to frame her face. She looked pale in the mirror, her green eyes too large in her face, but there was a set to her jaw that spoke of determination. Aunt Margaret was waiting in the corridor, already dressed in her lavender silk. The older woman's face was drawn with worry. "Whatever happens in that room," Margaret said quietly, as they made their way through marble corridors toward the throne room, "remember that you are James Hartley's daughter. You carry his courage and his integrity. No one can take that from you, no matter what they say." "You're frightening me, Aunt." "Good. You should be frightened. Court is never more dangerous than when it smells blood in the water." The throne room was vastly different from the ballroom, designed to intimidate rather than enchant. The ceiling soared 30 feet overhead, supported by columns of black marble veined with gold. The walls were covered in tapestries depicting the Ashford family's military victories going back 4 centuries. At the far end of the room, on a raised dais of 3 steps, stood 2 thrones carved from black walnut and inlaid with gold and sapphires. The room was already filling with courtiers, all of them whispering furiously to one another, speculation running rampant. Arabella and Margaret found a place near the middle of the assembly, surrounded by faces both curious and hostile. "I heard he's going to announce his engagement," one woman murmured behind them. "To Lady Cordelia Ravenscroft. It's been expected for months." "No, I heard it's about Prince Alexander," another countered. "Perhaps he's finally chosen a bride." Arabella's hands were trembling. She clasped them together, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Through the crowd she caught a glimpse of Cordelia, magnificent in a gown of deep purple that made her look like visiting royalty. The woman's dark eyes scanned the room with predatory interest, finally landing on Arabella. The smile that crossed Cordelia's face was pure malice. Then the herald's voice rang out, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "His Majesty, King Edmund Ashford." The crowd fell silent instantly, every head turning toward the entrance. The king entered alone without Prince Alexander, and Arabella's breath caught in her throat. He was dressed in formal court attire, a military uniform of deep navy blue adorned with gold braiding and the royal insignia. A cape of ermine hung from his shoulders. On his head sat the crown of Ashford, heavy gold set with sapphires and diamonds that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. But it was his face that held her attention. Without last night's mask, she could see him clearly for the first time. That strong jaw, those aristocratic features, the short beard and goatee that framed a mouth she remembered kissing in the moonlight, and those eyes, storm grey with steel-blue undertones, scanning the assembly until they found her. The world seemed to stop. Everything else fell away. The crowd, the whispers, the magnificent room with its reminders of power and history. There was only Edmund's gaze locked with hers, and in that moment, she knew. She knew with absolute certainty that it had been him in the garden. Him she'd kissed, him she'd promised herself to. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Edmund ascended the dais and settled into his throne with fluid grace. The crown looked heavy on his head, but he wore it as if it were part of him, as natural as breathing. When he spoke, his voice carried throughout the vast space. "I have called you here this morning to make an announcement of considerable importance to the realm." His eyes moved across the assembly, touching briefly on faces, reading the hunger and ambition written there. "As you all know, Queen Catherine died 3 years ago. Since that time I have ruled alone, but the succession requires stability. The crown requires heirs. My duty to this kingdom requires that I remarry." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Arabella saw Cordelia straighten, a triumphant gleam in her dark eyes. Several other women around the room adopted similar expressions of anticipation. "I have given this matter considerable thought," Edmund continued. "Marriage for a king is never simply a personal choice. It is a political act, an alliance, a statement about the future of the realm. My counselors have presented me with numerous candidates, all of them impeccably connected, all of them bringing substantial dowries and political advantages." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. The formal mask of kingship slipped for just a moment, and Arabella saw the man from the garden, the one who'd confessed that he'd forgotten how to be anything other than a king. "But I have decided," Edmund said quietly, his voice nonetheless carrying to every corner of the room, "that after 20 years of putting duty before everything else, I am entitled to choose based on something other than political advantage. I am entitled to choose a wife who makes me remember what it feels like to be human, who makes me believe that life might hold something other than endless responsibility and loss." The room had gone utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Arabella's heart was beating so hard she thought she might faint. Edmund's gaze found hers again, held it with an intensity that made breathing impossible. "Lady Arabella Hartley," he said, and her name in his deep voice seemed to echo through the chamber like a bell. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and queen?" The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, the sound of silk rustling as hundreds of people turned to stare at her. Arabella stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the king who had just asked her to marry him in front of the entire court. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. They'd shared one kiss, one conversation, one perfect moment in a garden. You didn't propose marriage based on that. Kings didn't marry nobody girls from Somerset with no fortune and no connections. "This is insane!" Cordelia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and furious. She strode forward through the crowd, her purple gown swirling around her like storm clouds. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This girl is nobody. She has nothing to offer the crown. No wealth, no family, no political value whatsoever. Edmund's expression went cold, regal authority settling over him like armor. Lady Ravenscroft, you forget yourself. I do not require your approval for my choice of bride. But the realm requires it. Cordelia was almost shaking with rage. You cannot expect us to accept some opportunistic little fortune hunter as our queen. That's enough. Edmund's voice cracked like a whip, silencing Cordelia mid-rant. He rose from his throne, descending the steps with measured dignity. The crown on his head caught the light, throwing rainbow prisms across the black marble floor. I will say this once, and I will say it clearly. Lady Arabella Hartley is the daughter of a man who saved my life, a woman of impeccable character and genuine warmth. She will be treated with the respect due to my future queen. Anyone who cannot manage that level of courtesy may leave court immediately. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Edmund had just drawn a line in the sand, and everyone in the room knew it. Cross him on this, and you would find yourself exiled from court, your political power eviscerated, your family's standing destroyed. Cordelia stood trembling, her face white with fury, but she said nothing more. After a long moment, she sank into a rigid curtsy and backed away. Edmund's gaze returned to Arabella. He was making his way through the crowd toward her, and people were stepping aside, creating a path. Arabella felt Margaret's hand squeeze her arm, felt her aunt's strength flowing into her. "Breathe," Margaret whispered. "Whatever you decide, just breathe." Edmund stopped before her, towering over her, the crown making him seem even taller. Up close, she could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He was as nervous as she was, she realized. This powerful king who commanded armies and nations was afraid of her answer. "Lady Arabella," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone even though the entire court was straining to hear. "I apologize for the public nature of this proposal. It was not my original intention, but my council insisted that matters of royal succession must be conducted with full transparency. I know this is overwhelming, I know we barely know each other, but what I felt last night in the garden was real. You made me feel alive for the first time in 3 years. Please, give me a chance to give you the world you deserve." The sincerity in his voice, in those storm-grey eyes, nearly broke her, but alongside the longing and the impossible attraction was a rising tide of anger. Because he'd put her in an impossible position, hadn't he? How could she say no in front of hundreds of people without humiliating him, without destroying any chance she had of a life at court, without making an enemy of the most powerful man in England? But how could she say yes? How could she agree to marry a man she'd met exactly once, regardless of how magical that meeting had been? How could she become queen when she could barely navigate being a guest at court? "Your Majesty," she said, and was proud that her voice remained steady, even as her insides churned with terror and confusion. "You honor me beyond measure, but this is a great deal to ask based on one evening's acquaintance. Might I have time to consider?" She saw the flash of disappointment in his eyes, quickly masked. But he nodded, executing a small bow that sent another ripple of shock through the observers. Kings did not bow to anyone. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. I will not press you for an answer." Then more quietly, "I'm sorry, I've handled this badly. I wanted to give you a fairy tale, and instead I've trapped you." Before she could respond, he turned and made his way back to the dais. The assembly was buzzing like a kicked beehive, whispers and speculation flying in every direction. "This audience is concluded," Edmund announced. "You are all dismissed." The crowd began to disperse, but slowly. Everyone still whispering, still staring at Arabella as if she'd grown a second head. Margaret gripped her arm and steered her toward the exit, moving quickly through the press of bodies. They'd almost made it to the door when a familiar voice stopped them. "Lady Hartley, a moment, if you please." Prince Alexander stood before them, golden and beautiful in the morning light, his blue eyes sparkling with something that might have been amusement. Up close, Arabella could see that he was even more handsome than she'd thought, his features perfect, symmetrical, the kind of face poets wrote sonnets about. "Your Highness," she murmured, executing a curtsy. "That was quite the dramatic announcement," Alexander said, his tone light, conversational. "My father doesn't usually go in for grand romantic gestures. You must have made quite an impression." Arabella didn't know what to say. "How did you respond to the prince when his father had just proposed marriage to you?" "I should offer my congratulations," Alexander continued, "though I confess I'm curious. What exactly happened in the garden last night to inspire such passion?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Arabella caught the undercurrent. He was testing her, trying to determine if she was a schemer, an opportunist, or simply a very lucky nobody. "We talked," Arabella said carefully. "About loss and loneliness and the weight of expectations, that's all." "And kissed?" Alexander's smile was charming but didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, Lady Hartley. The whole court knows you disappeared into the gardens for nearly an hour. We're not fools." "No," Arabella agreed quietly. "But I'm not a schemer, Your Highness. I didn't seduce your father for power or position. I didn't plan any of this." "Didn't you?" The question was soft, almost kind, but it landed like a blade. "Every woman who comes to court plans something, Lady Hartley, even if it's just to find a kind husband or make a useful connection. What were you planning when you accepted the invitation to the ball?" Heat flooded Arabella's cheeks because he was right. She had come with dreams of catching someone's eye, of experiencing romance, of maybe, impossibly, attracting the attention of a prince. Just not this prince. Not in this way. "I wanted something magical to happen," she admitted. "I wanted to feel like the world held possibilities. Is that so terrible?" "No." Alexander's expression softened fractionally. "It's human. But be careful, Lady Hartley. My father is a good man, but he's also a king. His needs, his obligations, will always come first. If you marry him thinking he'll simply be a devoted husband who adores you, you'll be disappointed." "Why are you telling me this?" Arabella asked. "If you disapprove, wouldn't you rather I refuse him?" "I don't disapprove." Alexander glanced back toward the throne room where his father still sat, crown heavy on his head, looking suddenly older and more tired than his 42 years. "I just don't want to see either of you hurt. My father has been through enough pain, and you seem like a decent person who doesn't deserve to be destroyed by court politics." With that cryptic warning, he bowed and walked away, leaving Arabella staring after him in confusion. "Come," Margaret said urgently, pulling her niece toward the corridor. "We need to talk privately." They made it to Arabella's chambers without further incident, though Arabella was aware of eyes following her, of whispers trailing in her wake. Inside, with the door safely closed, Margaret rounded on her. "Tell me everything," the older woman demanded. "Every word, every moment. I need to understand what happened last night." So Arabella told her. All of it. The walk through the gardens, the conversation by the fountain, the kiss that had set her world on fire, the promises whispered in moonlight, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When Arabella finished, the Dowager Duchess sank into a chair, looking suddenly old. "You're in love with him," Margaret said flatly. "After one conversation, one kiss, you've fallen completely in love." "Is that so impossible?" Arabella demanded. "You told me stories about my mother falling in love with my father at first sight." "That was different. Your parents were social equals. Your mother wasn't asked to become Queen of England based on a moonlit kiss." Margaret rubbed her temples as if fighting off a headache. "Arabella, do you have any idea what you're being asked to take on? It's not just marriage. It's a crown. It's being scrutinized every moment of every day. It's having your every word, your every action judged and weighed and criticized. It's giving up any semblance of a private life. I know it's not simple. It's impossible." Margaret's voice rose with uncharacteristic heat. "And that's not even addressing the real issue here." "What real issue?" "He's 42 years old, Arabella. Twice your age. Still grieving his dead wife. Desperate for connection because he's been alone and lonely for 3 years. What if this isn't about you at all? What if you're just convenient? A pretty face that made him feel young again for one night?" The words hit like physical blows, each one finding a mark. Because hadn't Arabella wondered the same thing in the darkest hours before dawn? Hadn't she questioned whether Edmund saw her or simply saw an escape from his loneliness? "He said I made him feel alive," Arabella whispered. "Not young, alive. He said there was a difference. And you believe him?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "I believe him because I felt it too. That connection, that recognition. It wasn't one-sided." Margaret studied her niece for a long moment, then sighed. "You're going to accept him, aren't you?" "I don't know." Arabella moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where her life had changed forever. "Part of me wants to run. To go back to Somerset and forget this ever happened. But another part—" "What?" "Another part thinks that maybe this is my purpose. Maybe I was meant to be here, meant to meet him, meant to remind him that he's more than just a king. Maybe I can actually make a difference in his life. Or maybe you'll be eaten alive by the court and destroyed in the process." They stood in silence, aunt and niece, both staring out at gardens that looked far less magical in daylight. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "If you decide to do this, I'll support you. I'll teach you everything I know about navigating court politics. I'll stand beside you against Cordelia and every other vulture circling for your blood." She paused, then added more softly, "But please, my dear girl, make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. Don't marry him because you feel trapped. Don't marry him out of gratitude for the invitation. Don't even marry him because of one perfect kiss in a garden." "Then what should I marry him for?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Marry him because you genuinely believe you can build a life together, because you're willing to fight for him and with him against all the forces that will try to tear you apart. Marry him because when you imagine your future, he's in it, and you can't imagine it any other way." Arabella closed her eyes, trying to envision the future Margaret described. She saw storm-grey eyes and a smile that transformed a tired face. She saw long conversations in that book-filled library, walks through gardens in every season, the possibility of children with their father's intensity and their mother's hope. She saw being seen, being valued, being loved not for what she could provide but for who she was. But she also saw the weight of a crown, the endless scrutiny, the loneliness of being elevated above everyone else. She saw the ghost of Catherine, the dead queen hovering between them. She saw the 21-year age gap and wondered if Edmund would always see her as a child playing at being queen. "I need time," Arabella said finally. "Time to think clearly without everyone watching. Time to figure out what I truly want." "Then take it," Margaret advised. "Edmund gave you permission to consider. Use it. Don't let the court pressure you into a hasty decision you'll regret for the rest of your life." But as the day wore on, Arabella discovered that time was a luxury no one at court was willing to grant her. Over the next 72 hours, she was visited by no fewer than 15 different courtiers, each with their own agenda. Some came offering congratulations laced with barely concealed envy. Others came with warnings about the impossibility of her position. Lady Cordelia sent a note that was so venomous, Arabella burned it rather than keep it in her chamber. Even Prince Alexander stopped by, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but clearly also assessing whether she was worthy of his father. The worst, however, were the ones who came offering advice that was really manipulation in disguise. A duchess who suggested Arabella should refuse the proposal unless Edmund agreed to certain political alliances. A lord who hinted that her acceptance could be contingent on financial arrangements for her family. A viscountess who implied that a smart woman would use this opportunity to extract maximum concessions from a desperate king. Arabella sent them all away, sickened by the naked ambition, the mercenary calculations, the complete absence of anything resembling genuine emotion or care. On the third evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, there was a knock at her door. The maid announced simply, "His Majesty requests your presence in the private library, my lady." Arabella's heart leapt into her throat. She'd seen Edmund only at a distance since the proposal, always surrounded by counsellors and courtiers, always wearing the mask of kingship. But now he was asking to see her, alone. In that intimate space she'd glimpsed only briefly during a tour of the palace. She changed into a simple evening dress of green muslin that brought out her eyes, then made her way through the marble corridors to the library. A footman stood guard outside, but when she approached, he simply opened the door and gestured her inside. The library was exactly as she remembered from her brief glimpse during the palace tour, but somehow more intimate in the firelight. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark oak crammed with leather-bound volumes, the smell of old paper and wood smoke, and something else, something distinctly masculine. A fire crackled in the black marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the worn burgundy leather chairs positioned before it. Edmund stood by the windows, looking out at the same gardens where they'd shared that first kiss. He'd shed the formal crown and military uniform, wearing instead simple dark breeches, white linen shirt open at the collar, and a dark green vest. He looked younger like this, less intimidating, though no less powerful for the informality. He turned when he heard her enter, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Relief, longing, hope. And underneath it all, bone-deep exhaustion. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't certain you would." "You're the king," Arabella replied, trying for lightness even as her heart hammered. "When you request someone's presence, they come. That's not why you're here, though." He moved away from the window, gesturing to one of the chairs by the fire. "Please, sit." "I owe you an apology." Arabella settled into the chair, feeling the worn leather conform to her body. It was comfortable in a way that spoke of years of use, of long nights reading by firelight. Edmund took the chair opposite, close enough that she could see the firelight reflecting in his grey-blue eyes. "I handled everything wrong," he said without preamble. "The public proposal, the way I trapped you in front of the entire court. I thought I was giving you a grand romantic gesture, but what I actually did was force you into an impossible position. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice, the genuine remorse in his expression, eased something tight in Arabella's chest. "I understand why you did it. The succession requires transparency. Your council demanded it. My council can go to hell." The curse coming from a king was startling. Edmund ran a hand through his hair, mussing the carefully groomed strands. "I'm so tired, Arabella. So tired of doing everything for political reasons, for strategic purposes, for the good of the realm. For once, just once, I wanted to do something purely because it felt right. And proposing to a woman you'd met once felt right." She couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "Yes." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I know how it sounds. I know how insane it is. But in that garden, talking to you, kissing you, it was the first time in 3 years I remembered what it felt like to want something for myself. To want someone." "You're still grieving Catherine," Arabella said softly. "Everyone says you loved her very much." "I did love her, I do love her, but that's not the same as being in love with her." Edmund's eyes were distant, looking at memories Arabella couldn't see. "Catherine and I were arranged by our parents when I was 18 and she was 16. We married at 20 and 18 respectively. We spent 18 years together, had Alexander, built a life. But it was a partnership, not a passion. She was my best friend, my co-ruler, the mother of my child. Losing her was devastating because she was such a fundamental part of my life. But what I felt for her and what I felt kissing you in the garden, they're completely different things." Arabella's hands twisted in her lap. "How can you be sure what you felt wasn't just loneliness? Desperation for any connection after 3 years alone?" "Because I've had plenty of opportunities for connection." Edmund's voice was firm. "Cordelia Ravenscroft has been throwing herself at me for over a year. A dozen other women have made their interest abundantly clear. If all I wanted was someone to ease the loneliness, I had options far more politically advantageous than you." The blunt assessment should have stung, but Arabella found herself appreciating his honesty. "Then what made me different?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "You saw me. Not the king, not the crown or the power or the political advantage I represent. You saw Edmund, the man who was tired and lonely and scared he'd forgotten how to be human. You talked to me about loss and poetry and riding through morning mist. You made me laugh. You made me want to be better than I've been. He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. "I'm not asking you to save me, Arabella. I'm not looking for some magical cure for grief or loneliness. I'm simply asking if you felt even a fraction of what I felt in that garden. Because if you did, then maybe we have a foundation to build on. Maybe we can create something real, something that doesn't exist simply because it's politically expedient." "I did feel it," Arabella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I felt like I'd been asleep my whole life, and you woke me up. Like every romantic story I'd ever read suddenly made sense because I finally understood what it meant to truly want someone." "Then what's stopping you from saying yes?" "Fear." The word burst out of her. "I'm 21 years old. I've never even run my own household, let alone an entire kingdom. I don't know how to be a queen. I don't know how to navigate court politics without getting destroyed. I don't know if I'm strong enough to withstand the scrutiny, the hatred, the endless pressure." "You're James Hartley's daughter," Edmund said firmly. "The man who pulled me from beneath a panicked horse without hesitation, who stemmed the bleeding with his own coat, who probably saved my life. That kind of courage runs in the blood. You're stronger than you think. And what if I'm not? What if I fail? What if I embarrass you, damage the crown, prove everyone right when they say I'm not worthy?" Edmund rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his much larger ones. The gesture, a king kneeling before a minor noblewoman, was so unprecedented that Arabella's breath caught in her throat. "Then we'll face that together," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I won't let you drown, Arabella. I won't throw you to the wolves and expect you to survive on your own. If you agree to be my wife, you'll have me as your partner, your advocate, your defender. I'll teach you everything you need to know about being queen. I'll stand between you and anyone who tries to hurt you. Edmund." She touched his face, feeling the texture of his beard beneath her palm, seeing the hope and fear mingling in his storm-grey eyes. "You can't protect me from everything. You can't shield me from the reality of what this life would be." "No," he agreed, "but I can promise you won't face it alone. I can promise that whatever challenges come, we'll meet them together. And I can promise that when I asked you to marry me, I wasn't asking you to be a convenient solution to a political problem. I was asking because I believe, with everything in me, that you and I could build something extraordinary." Arabella looked at him, really looked at him. Not the king with his crown and ermine cape, not the widower trapped in grief, not even the mysterious stranger from the garden. Just Edmund, a man who'd forgotten how to hope until she'd reminded him, a man who was offering her the world even as he admitted he couldn't protect her from all of its cruelties. "I need more time," she said finally, "not because I don't feel what you feel, but because I need to be absolutely certain I'm strong enough to be what you need." Disappointment flickered across his features, but he nodded, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "How much time?" "A week, maybe 2. I need to talk to Aunt Margaret, to really think about what I'd be taking on, to prepare myself mentally for the reality rather than the fantasy. Take as long as you need." Edmund's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin in a gesture that sent shivers down her spine. "Just promise me you'll make the decision based on what you want, not what you think you should want, or what the court tells you to do." "I promise." He leaned down, and for a moment she thought he would kiss her, but instead he pressed his lips to her forehead, tender and chaste, and somehow more intimate than a passionate kiss would have been. "Whatever you decide," he murmured against her skin, "thank you for reminding me what it feels like to truly want something, to truly want someone." As Arabella left the library and made her way back through the darkening corridors, she realized something crucial. Edmund had given her permission to refuse him. He'd laid out all his vulnerabilities, all his hopes and fears, and then told her to choose freely. That took a kind of courage most men would never possess. And it made her more certain than ever that her choice, whatever it ended up being, would be the right one. Because Edmund wasn't trying to manipulate her or pressure her. He was simply being honest about what he felt and what he hoped for. Now she just had to figure out if she was brave enough to hope for the same things. The next 10 days were both the longest and shortest of Arabella's life. She spent hours in conversation with Aunt Margaret, dissecting every aspect of what marriage to Edmund would entail. Margaret was ruthlessly honest, painting a picture of court life that was equal parts privilege and prison. "You'll never be alone again," Margaret warned. "Every moment will be scrutinized. Every word you speak in public will be analyzed for hidden meanings. You'll have ladies-in-waiting whose primary loyalty may not be to you, but to their family's political interests. You'll attend endless functions where you must smile and be charming even when you're exhausted or unwell. Your children won't really be yours. They'll belong to the realm, shaped and molded according to political necessity." But Margaret also helped her see the potential positives. You'll have resources to actually make a difference. You could patronize the arts, support charitable causes, use your position to help people who have no voice. You'll have access to the finest education, the most brilliant minds, opportunities most women will never experience. And if Edmund is true to his word about being a partner, you'll be ruling alongside one of the most capable monarchs England has ever had. Arabella also sought out other voices. She spoke with a countess who'd been at court for 30 years, learning the unspoken rules and dangerous pitfalls. She talked to a duchess who'd made a successful political marriage, discovering that affection could grow between two people, even when romance hadn't been the foundation. She even had a surprisingly frank conversation with one of Prince Alexander's friends, who admitted that the prince was concerned his father was moving too fast, but also hopeful that Arabella might make Edmund happy. Through it all, she caught glimpses of Edmund. Always from a distance, always surrounded by his duties and responsibilities, but sometimes their eyes would meet across a crowded room and she'd see the question there, the hope, the fear. And every time, her heart would give that same dangerous lurch it had given in the garden. On the 10th day, as spring rain drummed against the windows of her chamber, Arabella finally admitted the truth to herself. She was in love with Edmund Ashford, deeply, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. Not with the king, not with the crown, but with the man who'd confessed his loneliness by a moonlit fountain, the man who'd knelt before her in his private library, the man who'd given her permission to refuse him because he wanted her choice to be free. But love, she'd learned, wasn't always enough. Love didn't prepare you for the ruthlessness of court politics or the weight of a crown. Love didn't protect you from failure or guarantee happiness. Still, when she imagined her future, when she let herself truly envision the life ahead of her, Edmund was in it. In every scenario, every possibility, every dream she dared to dream, he was there. And the thought of a life without him, of going back to Somerset and spending the rest of her years wondering what might have been, felt like a kind of death. That evening, she requested an audience with the king. Not in the library this time, but in the formal receiving room, where protocol demanded they interact as sovereign and subject rather than as Edmund and Arabella. He was waiting when she arrived, dressed in his formal attire, the crown once again heavy on his head. But when the footman closed the doors, leaving them alone, he pulled the crown off and set it aside with visible relief. "I hate that thing," he muttered. "It gives me a headache." Despite her nervousness, Arabella smiled. "I'm not sure you're supposed to admit that. I'm admitting all kinds of things I'm not supposed to lately." His eyes searched her face. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question. Somehow he knew. Arabella took a deep breath, steadying herself for what came next. "I have. But before I tell you, I need to say something. Anything. I'm not going to be a perfect queen. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to stumble, say the wrong things, probably offend people without meaning to. I'm going to need your patience and your guidance and your support, possibly more than is fair to ask from anyone. I know. I'm also not Catherine. I can't replace her, and I won't try. Whatever we build together needs to be its own thing, not a recreation of what you had before. I know that too. And I'm scared." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Absolutely terrified, because this isn't a fairy tale, and I'm not some naive girl who thinks love conquers all. But I also know that when I imagine my future, you're in it. Always. And I don't know if that's destiny or delusion or something in between, but it's the truth." Edmund moved toward her slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. But she didn't move. didn't look away, meeting his gaze with all the courage she could muster. "So?" His voice was rough with emotion. "What's your answer?" "Yes." The word came out steady and sure, surprising her with its certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because you're a king or because you can give me a crown, but because you make me feel alive, because you see me, because even though I'm terrified, I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of anything the court might do to me." Edmund's eyes closed, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you for being brave enough to say yes." This time when he kissed her, it was different from the garden. There was still passion, still that electric connection that made her blood sing. But there was also tenderness, gratitude, the sense of two people choosing each other, despite all the logical reasons they shouldn't. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. "I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of this choice," he said. "I promise I'll protect you, support you, stand beside you no matter what comes. And I promise I'll try my best to be the queen you need me to be," Arabella replied. "Even when I'm terrified, even when it's hard, even when the court makes me want to run back to Somerset and hide." Edmund laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "If it helps, running back to Somerset and hiding sounds appealing to me most days too." "We could do it," Arabella suggested, half joking. "Just leave the crown on the throne with a note saying 'gone fishing' and disappear." Tempting. Very tempting, but I think my counsel might object. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the rain drum against the windows. Outside, the court was waiting. Outside, there were 1,000 challenges to face, 1,000 ways this could all go wrong. But in this moment, in this room, there was only Edmund and Arabella and the fragile, precious hope that they might actually make this work. "When?" Arabella asked. "When do you want to announce our engagement?" "Tomorrow, if you're ready. We'll do it properly this time, together, facing the court as partners. Tomorrow, then." She pulled back enough to look at him fully. "But tonight, could we just talk, like we did in the garden? I want to know you, Edmund. All of you. Not just the king or the grieving widower, but the man underneath." His smile transformed his face, made him look years younger. "I would like nothing more. Come." He led her to a small private sitting room adjacent to the receiving room, a space clearly meant for intimate conversations rather than state business. They settled on a sofa near the fireplace, and for hours they talked. About everything and nothing. About his childhood as a second son, who never expected to be king until his older brother died of pneumonia. About her mother's death and how it had shaped her relationship with her father. About books they loved, music that moved them, dreams they'd harbored in secret. And slowly, piece by piece, they began building the foundation of something real. Not a fairy tale, not a political alliance, but a genuine partnership between two people who'd found each other against all odds and were brave enough to believe they could make it work. When the clock struck midnight and Arabella finally rose to return to her chambers, Edmund walked her to the door. At the threshold he caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Sleep well, my future queen," he murmured. "Sleep well, my future husband," she replied. As she made her way through the silent corridors back to her room, Arabella felt a sense of rightness settling into her bones. Yes, challenges lay ahead. Yes, the court would be cruel and the scrutiny relentless. Yes, there would be moments when she questioned her decision and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But she'd also have Edmund. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. The announcement of the royal engagement was made the following morning in the same throne room where Edmund had first proposed. But this time Arabella stood beside him on the dais, her hand clasped in his, facing the court together. The reaction was mixed. Some of the court seemed genuinely pleased, others maintained neutral expressions that hid their true feelings, and a significant minority, led by Lady Cordelia, radiated barely concealed hostility. But Edmund made it clear through word and deed that Arabella had his complete support. "Lady Arabella Hartley has honoured me by accepting my proposal of marriage," he announced, his deep voice carrying authority. "She will be my wife, your queen, and I expect her to be treated with the respect and deference due to that position. Anyone who cannot manage that basic courtesy need not remain at court." It was the same warning he'd issued before, but this time Arabella was beside him, a united front rather than an isolated target. She felt the difference in how the courtiers looked at her, still calculating, still assessing, but with a new wariness. She wasn't just a nobody girl anymore. She was the king's chosen bride, and attacking her now meant attacking Edmund himself. Over the following weeks, Arabella's life transformed completely. She moved from guest chambers into the Queen's apartments, a suite of rooms that hadn't been occupied since Catherine's death. The first time she entered them, she'd felt like an intruder, surrounded by the ghost of the woman who'd come before her. But Edmund had anticipated this, ordering the rooms completely redecorated before she moved in. "This is your space now," he'd told her firmly. "Not Catherine's, not some generic Queen's chambers. Yours. Make it reflect who you are." So she had. The heavy burgundy drapes were replaced with lighter fabrics in shades of green and cream. The dark furniture was swapped for pieces in lighter wood. Books she loved lined the shelves, and the scent of fresh flowers always filled the air. It became a sanctuary, a place where she could be simply Arabella rather than the future queen. Aunt Margaret became her closest advisor, teaching her the intricate dance of court politics with ruthless efficiency. "Never trust anyone completely," Margaret warned. "Even people who seem like friends may be reporting your words back to their patrons. Be gracious to everyone, but intimate with few. Smile often, speak carefully, and never ever show weakness where the court can see it." Arabella also acquired ladies-in-waiting, carefully chosen by Edmund and Margaret to be genuinely loyal rather than political plants. They were younger women from respectable but not overly ambitious families, and to her surprise, some of them became real friends. Lady Beatrice, in particular, proved to be both sensible and genuinely kind, someone Arabella could talk to during the long hours of fittings and protocol lessons, because there were lessons, so many lessons, how to walk with the weight and dignity expected of a queen, how to make small talk at state dinners, how to decode the subtle power plays in seemingly innocent conversations, which nobles were allies, which were neutral, and which were enemies waiting for an opportunity to strike, the complex web of family connections that governed court politics, the proper forms of address for everyone from dukes to merchants, the etiquette of formal court presentations, the symbolism behind different colors and jewels and styles of dress. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and sometimes Arabella would retreat to her chambers and simply cry from the pressure of it all. But Edmund was always there, appearing at her door with wine and sympathy, listening as she vented her frustrations, reminding her that she didn't have to be perfect. She just had to try. "The court expects perfection," he told her one evening as they sat together in his library, their favorite refuge from prying eyes. "But I don't. I expect honesty, effort, the courage to keep going even when it's hard, and you have all of that in abundance." Their relationship deepened during those weeks. They spent nearly every evening together, sometimes in the library surrounded by books, sometimes walking in the gardens, occasionally dining privately in his chambers. They talked about everything: his fears about being an adequate father to Alexander, her worries about living up to Catherine's legacy, their shared love of poetry and music, their dreams for the kind of monarchy they could build together. And slowly, inevitably, friendship deepened into something more. There were kisses that left them both breathless, embraces that lasted longer than propriety strictly allowed, moments when the attraction between them threatened to overwhelm every other consideration. But Edmund maintained strict boundaries, insisting that they wait until their wedding night despite Arabella's protests that such restraint wasn't necessary. "I want to do this right," he'd said firmly when she'd questioned his insistence. "I want to give you every honor, every respect. The court already whispers that you seduced me. I won't give them more ammunition by taking liberties before we're properly married." His protectiveness touched her even as it frustrated her, because she wanted him with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. Wanted his touch, his kisses, the promise of intimacy that seemed to shimmer in the air whenever they were alone together. But she also appreciated that he was thinking of her reputation, her dignity. her position in ways she hadn't fully considered. It was another reminder that despite the passion between them, Edmund never forgot that she would be queen, and queens were held to impossible standards. Not everyone was pleased by their growing closeness, of course. Lady Cordelia continued her campaign of subtle sabotage, spreading rumours, making veiled comments designed to undermine Arabella's confidence. Prince Alexander maintained a careful distance, polite but cool, making it clear he remained unconvinced that this marriage was wise. And there were countless other courtiers who saw Arabella as an upstart, an interloper, someone who needed to be put in her place. The worst incident came 6 weeks before the scheduled wedding. Arabella was attending a formal tea hosted by the Duchess of Pembroke, one of the most powerful women at court. The event should have been a simple social gathering, but Arabella quickly realized it was actually a test, a chance for the established court ladies to assess whether she measured up to their standards. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Arabella made polite conversation, complimented the Duchess on her magnificent home, carefully navigated the minefield of court gossip without saying anything that could be used against her. But then Lady Cordelia arrived late, making a dramatic entrance in a gown that was clearly designed to outshine everyone else in the room. "Lady Arabella," Cordelia exclaimed with false warmth, "how delightful to see you looking so fresh. Quite the change from your usual rather simple style." It was a perfectly calibrated insult, implying that Arabella's taste in fashion was provincial, while also suggesting she was trying too hard to fit in. Several of the other ladies tittered behind their fans. Arabella felt heat flood her cheeks, but forced herself to smile. "Lady Cordelia, how kind of you to notice. I do try to dress appropriately for the occasion, rather than making every event about my own desire for attention." The responding silence was sharp as a blade. Several ladies gasped. Cordelia's face went white with rage. Arabella's heart was pounding, but she held her ground, meeting Cordelia's furious gaze without flinching. "I see the king's charity case has developed claws," Cordelia said softly, dangerously. "How common?" "What's common," came a new voice from the doorway, "is attacking someone simply because they pose a threat to your ambitions." Every head turned. Prince Alexander stood at the entrance to the drawing room, magnificent in a tailcoat of midnight blue, his golden hair catching the afternoon light. He moved into the room with the easy grace of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. "Your Highness," the Duchess of Pembroke stammered, rising to curtsy, "we weren't expecting—" "Clearly." Alexander's blue eyes were cold as they swept across Lady Cordelia. "Otherwise, I'm certain Lady Ravenscroft would have exercised more restraint in her choice of targets, unless she's foolish enough to insult my father's future wife in my presence." Cordelia sank into a deep curtsy, her face burning with humiliation. "Your Highness, I meant no disrespect." "Of course you did." "You meant exactly the disrespect you delivered." Alexander turned to Arabella, and his expression softened fractionally. "Lady Arabella, perhaps you'd honor me with a walk in the gardens. I find the atmosphere in here has become rather stifling." It was a rescue, clearly, but also a public statement. Prince Alexander, who'd been coolly distant since the engagement announcement, was now openly taking her side against one of the most powerful women at court. The message was unmistakable. Attack Arabella and you attack the royal family itself. Arabella rose, executing a perfect curtsy to the Duchess. "Thank you for your hospitality, Your Grace. It's been most illuminating." As she took Alexander's offered arm and they left the drawing room, she could feel the weight of all those eyes on her back. She'd scored a victory today, but she'd also made enemies. Real enemies, the kind that didn't forgive slights easily. Outside in the manicured gardens of the Pembroke estate, Alexander released her arm, and they walked in silence for several moments. "Thank you," Arabella said finally. "You didn't have to do that." "No, I didn't," Alexander agreed. "But despite my reservations about this marriage, you're going to be my stepmother, strange as that concept is, and you'll be queen. That position deserves respect, regardless of my personal feelings." "Personal feelings which are—" Arabella ventured. Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the sunlight, his handsome features were almost painfully perfect, like something carved from marble. But his eyes held a world-weariness that seemed incongruous with his 23 years. "Complicated," he admitted. "I think my father is rushing into this for the wrong reasons. I think he's confusing loneliness with love, and that you're both going to be hurt in the end. But I also see how he looks at you, and I can't remember the last time I saw him look at anyone that way. Not even my mother." The admission clearly cost him something. Arabella felt a rush of sympathy for this golden prince who seemed to have everything, but understood all too well the cost of crowns and duty. "I love him," she said quietly. "I know it sounds insane after such a short time, and I know the court thinks I'm either a schemer or a fool. But I genuinely love your father, Alexander. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make him happy and to be the queen this country needs. Even if it destroys you in the process? Even then." Alexander studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish, possibly both. But for what it's worth, I hope you succeed, because if you don't, it won't just be you who pays the price. It'll be my father too. And he's already paid enough." They walked back to the palace in companionable silence, and Arabella felt something shift between them. Not friendship exactly, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. It was a start. That evening, when Edmund asked about the tea as they shared dinner in his private chambers, Arabella told him everything. His face darkened with anger when she described Cordelia's insults, but he also seemed pleased when she recounted how Alexander had intervened. "He's protective of you," Edmund said with obvious satisfaction. "Despite his reservations, that's good. You'll need allies in the family." "I have you," Arabella pointed out. "Always." Edmund reached across the table to take her hand. "But I can't be everywhere at once, and Alexander has influence with the younger courtiers that I don't. If he's willing to defend you, others will fall in line." "Edmund," Arabella squeezed his hand. "Are you sure about this? About us? Because if you're having any doubts, now is the time to speak. Once we're married, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His grey-blue eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "Are you having doubts?" "Constantly," she admitted. "I doubt I'm strong enough, smart enough, capable enough. I doubt I can live up to Catherine's legacy or meet the court's expectations. I doubt I know what I'm doing at all. But you're doing it anyway. Because of you, because when I'm with you I feel like maybe I actually could be the person you seem to think I am." Edmund rose from his chair and moved around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. The embrace was warm and solid and exactly what she needed. "You're already that person," he murmured against her hair. "You just haven't realized it yet. But I see it. Your strength, your courage, your capacity for kindness despite all the cruelty you've faced. You're going to be a remarkable queen, Arabella, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful you were brave enough to say yes." She tilted her face up to kiss him, and he responded with an intensity that made her knees weak. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and she felt his control start to slip. But then he pulled back, breathing hard, resting his forehead against hers. "6 more weeks," he said roughly. "I can survive 6 more weeks." "Can I?" Arabella asked, only half joking. "You can, we both can. Because when we finally come together as husband and wife, it's going to be worth the wait. I promise you that." The promise in his voice, in his eyes, sent heat flooding through her. 6 weeks. It felt like an eternity. But she'd waited this long. She could wait a little longer. What neither of them knew as they stood there wrapped in each other's arms was that waiting would prove far more difficult than either of them imagined, because the court had other plans, and in the next few weeks forces would align to test their commitment in ways neither could have anticipated. The storm began brewing 3 weeks before the wedding. Arabella was in her chambers being fitted for her wedding gown, a magnificent creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace with seed pearls forming intricate patterns across the bodice, when Aunt Margaret appeared with an expression that promised trouble. "Leave us," Margaret commanded the seamstresses. They fled immediately, reading the Duchess's mood with practiced ease. When they were alone, Margaret handed Arabella a folded piece of parchment. "This arrived at my chambers this morning. I debated showing it to you at all, but you need to know what you're facing." Arabella unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was elegant, the paper expensive, but the words were poison. To whom it may concern. Be advised that Lady Arabella Hartley entered the Royal Masquerade Ball with the specific intention of seducing either the King or Prince Alexander to secure herself a position at court. She has confessed as much to several confidants, including boasting that any fool can catch a lonely man if she knows how to play on his grief. Her campaign to become queen is nothing more than calculated manipulation of a grieving widower's vulnerabilities. The court deserves to know the truth about the woman who would wear Catherine's crown. There was no signature, but Arabella didn't need one. This was Cordelia's work, or someone allied with her. It was all lies, of course. She'd never said any such thing, never confessed any such intentions. But that didn't matter. The letter was circulating through court, being copied and distributed, poisoning minds against her. "How many people have seen this?" Arabella asked, her voice surprisingly steady given how her hands were shaking. "At least 50 by my last count. Probably more by now." Margaret's face was grim. "Edmund needs to know." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. Arabella forced herself to breathe, to think. If we bring this to Edmund, he'll try to suppress it, punish whoever's spreading it. That will only make things worse, make it look like we have something to hide. So, what do you propose? Arabella stared at the letter, anger beginning to burn through the initial shock. She'd been so careful, so cautious, doing everything right. And still they were coming for her, twisting her every action into something sinister. "I need to address the court directly," she said finally. "Not hide behind Edmund's protection, but face them myself. Show them I'm not some manipulative schemer, but a real person who made a genuine choice." "That's dangerous," Margaret warned. "You give them an opportunity to attack you directly." "They're already attacking me. At least this way I get to defend myself." It took 2 days to arrange. Edmund resisted at first, wanting to shield her from the court's viciousness. But Arabella stood firm, and eventually he relented, though not without reservations. The venue was the same throne room where Edmund had first proposed. This time, Arabella stood alone at its center, facing an assembly that clearly anticipated blood sport. She could see Cordelia near the front, dark eyes gleaming with anticipation. Prince Alexander stood to one side, his expression unreadable. And on the dais, Edmund sat rigid with tension, his hands gripping the arms of his throne so tightly his knuckles were white. Arabella took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and spoke. "I know many of you have seen the letter currently circulating through court, the one that paints me as a calculating seductress who deliberately targeted the king for personal gain. I'm here to address those claims directly." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Arabella kept her voice steady. "I won't lie to you and claim I had no hopes when I came to the masquerade ball. I did hope. I hoped to experience something magical, to feel special, to maybe catch someone's eye. Every unmarried woman at that ball had similar hopes. The difference is that mine actually came true." She paused, letting that sink in. Several courtiers shifted uncomfortably. "But here's what the letter doesn't tell you. When I walked into those gardens that night, I had no idea I was talking to the king. The man was masked, as was everyone. I couldn't have targeted him specifically because I didn't know who he was until the next morning. What I did know was that I was talking to someone who understood loss, who felt the weight of expectations, who made me feel seen for the first time in my life." Her eyes found Edmund's, drew strength from what she saw there. "The letter accuses me of manipulating a grieving widower. But here's the truth about grief, that those who haven't experienced it might not understand. Grief doesn't make you weak or vulnerable to manipulation. Grief makes you more discerning, more careful, more aware of authenticity versus performance. Edmund Ashford has dealt with schemers and opportunists for 20 years. Do you really think he's so foolish that he'd be taken in by someone with ulterior motives?" She turned to address the wider assembly. "I am not Catherine. I will never be Catherine. I'm not trying to replace her or erase her memory. I'm simply trying to be the best version of myself that I can be. And yes, I'm young. Yes, I lack experience. Yes, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm also going to work harder than anyone in this room can possibly imagine to earn the position I've been offered. The room was completely silent now. Even Cordelia had stopped smirking. Some of you will never accept me. Some of you are convinced I'm unworthy, no matter what I do or say. That's your prerogative. But I'm asking those of you who are still undecided to give me a chance. Judge me by my actions, not by anonymous letters written by people too cowardly to sign their names. Watch what I do, not what others claim I've said. And if, after I've been given a fair opportunity, you still find me wanting, then your criticism will be deserved. She looked directly at Cordelia. To whoever wrote that letter, I say this. You've shown your hand, you've revealed yourself as someone who fights with lies and innuendo because you can't compete on merit, and in doing so, you've made yourself irrelevant. Because I'm not going to waste my energy fighting you. I'm going to channel that energy into being the best queen I can possibly be, and that will be my revenge. With that, she curtsied deeply to Edmund, then to the assembly, and walked from the room with her head held high. She made it to her chambers before the trembling started, before the full weight of what she'd just done crashed over her. She'd thrown down a gauntlet, declared war, essentially, on everyone who'd been spreading rumors. It was either going to establish her as someone to be taken seriously or mark her as an arrogant upstart who needed to be destroyed. The knock came an hour later. Arabella opened the door to find Edmund standing there, still in his formal attire, the crown heavy on his head. But his expression was unreadable. That was either the bravest thing I've ever witnessed, he said quietly, or the most foolish. Possibly both, Arabella admitted. He stepped into her chambers and she closed the door behind him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Edmund began to laugh, a sound of pure relief and admiration. You magnificent, impossible woman, he said, pulling her into his arms. Do you have any idea what you just did? You took control of the narrative. You called out your enemies without naming them. You appealed to the reasonable while putting the unreasonable on notice. You were perfect. I was terrified, Arabella confessed against his chest. I know I could see it, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Arabella. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. They stood there for several moments, wrapped in each other, drawing strength and comfort. Finally, Edmund pulled back enough to look at her face. 3 more weeks, he said. Can you survive 3 more weeks of this? With you beside me? I can survive anything. Then let's show them what we're made of. Together. The final 3 weeks before the wedding were a whirlwind of activity and mounting tension. The public response to Arabella's speech was mixed, as she'd expected. Some courtiers seemed genuinely impressed by her courage and candor. Others doubled down on their hostility, seeing her words as presumptuous. But something had shifted. Where before she'd been treated as an interloper who could be easily dismissed, she was now taken seriously as a force to be reckoned with. Not everyone liked her, but everyone now understood she wouldn't be bullied into submission. Lady Cordelia, in particular, seemed to retreat, her viciousness replaced by cold calculation. Arabella knew the woman was simply regrouping, planning her next move. But for now there was an uneasy truce. The days blurred together in a haze of final preparations. The wedding gown was completed, a masterpiece of ivory, silk and lace that made Arabella feel like something out of a fairy tale every time she saw it. The ceremony was planned down to the smallest detail, designed to be both magnificent and meaningful. Guest lists were finalized, seating arrangements debated, menus selected and selected again. Through it all, Edmund was a constant presence. They stole moments together whenever possible. Early morning walks in the gardens, late evening conversations in the library, stolen kisses in shadowed corridors when they thought no one was watching. The passion between them continued to build, becoming almost unbearable in its intensity. I'm going to die of frustration before the wedding, Edmund muttered one evening as they pulled apart from a kiss that had left them both breathing hard. This was a terrible idea. We should have just gotten married immediately and dealt with the gossip. Only 2 more weeks, Arabella reminded him, though her own body was aching with need. We've made it this far. Barely. But they did make it, through scandals and setbacks, through Cordelia's continued machinations, through Prince Alexander's gradual warming toward Arabella, through the endless pressure and scrutiny and doubt. They made it to the wedding day itself. Arabella woke before dawn on her wedding morning to find Aunt Margaret already in her chambers, looking unusually emotional. "Your mother would be so proud," Margaret said softly, touching Arabella's face with a tenderness the older woman rarely showed. "You've become everything she hoped you'd be, strong, kind, brave, and you're about to marry a man who sees all of that and values it." "I'm terrified," Arabella admitted. "Good. You should be. This is terrifying. But you're going to be magnificent." The preparations took hours, the bath scented with rose oil and lavender, the careful application of subtle cosmetics to enhance her natural beauty without looking painted, the elaborate arrangement of her hair, pinned and curled and woven through with pearls and tiny diamonds, and finally the dress. When she saw herself in the mirror, Arabella hardly recognized the woman staring back. The gown transformed her into something ethereal, the ivory silk seeming to glow against her skin. The bodice was fitted perfectly, the neckline elegant and modest, the sleeves delicate puffs of lace and silk. The skirt flowed in layers of the finest fabric, creating an effect like a waterfall of light. A veil of Belgian lace, so fine it was almost transparent, crowned her elaborate hairstyle, held in place by a tiara that had belonged to Edmund's grandmother. She looked like a queen. "It's time," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. The ceremony was held in the palace chapel, a soaring Gothic space of stained glass and carved stone that had witnessed royal weddings for 300 years. Every pew was filled with nobility in their finest attire, a sea of silk and jewels and barely concealed curiosity. As Arabella made her way down the long aisle on Aunt Margaret's arm, her father being dead, Margaret had insisted on giving her away. She was aware of all those eyes on her, judging, assessing, wondering if she'd last a year as queen before the pressure broke her. But then she saw Edmund waiting at the altar, and everything else fell away. He was magnificent in full ceremonial dress, his military uniform dark navy with gold braiding that caught the light from the stained glass windows. The crown of Ashford sat on his head, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. As she drew closer, she could see his hands trembling slightly, could see the emotion swimming in those storm-grey eyes. She'd done this. She'd made this powerful king nervous with anticipation. The thought filled her with a heady rush of power and tenderness all at once. Margaret placed Arabella's hand in Edmund's, and Arabella felt the solid strength of him, the warmth of his skin against hers. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the ceremony, his voice sonorous and formal. But Arabella barely heard the words. She was too focused on Edmund, on the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When it came time for the vows, Edmund's voice was steady and clear. "I, Edmund William Ashford, take you, Arabella Marie Hartley, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever trials may come. I promise to see you, truly see you, every day for the rest of our lives. And I promise that I will spend every moment trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me by choosing to be mine." The traditional vows, but also something more. Something personal and heartfelt that made several ladies in the congregation dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Arabella's turn. Her voice shook slightly at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "I, Arabella Marie Hartley, take you, Edmund William Ashford, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, support you, challenge you when necessary, and stand beside you as your partner in all things. I promise to be brave even when I'm terrified, to be strong even when I feel weak. And I promise that I will never forget the man you were in that garden, the one who reminded me what it means to truly want someone. That's the man I'm marrying today, not the crown. You." Edmund's eyes were bright with unshed tears. His hand tightened on hers as if he'd never let go. "The rings," the Archbishop intoned. Prince Alexander stepped forward, carrying a velvet cushion with 2 bands of gold. Edmund took the smaller one, a delicate circle set with diamonds and sapphires that matched Arabella's engagement ring. He slid it onto her finger, with fingers that trembled slightly. Arabella took the larger band, heavy gold engraved with symbols of protection and fidelity. She slid it onto Edmund's finger, this tangible proof that she was claiming him just as much as he was claiming her. "By the power vested in me," the Archbishop declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Your Majesty, you may kiss your bride." Edmund lifted her veil with careful reverence, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness that stole her breath. It was gentle, reverent, a promise of all the kisses to come. The congregation erupted in applause, but Arabella barely heard it. There was only Edmund, only this moment, only the certainty that whatever came next they would face it together. When they finally broke apart, Edmund whispered against her lips, "Hello, my queen." "Hello, my king," she whispered back. They processed back down the aisle together, hand in hand, facing the court not as king and subject but as husband and wife, partners, equals in all the ways that mattered. The reception was a magnificent affair in the palace ballroom, the same room where Arabella had first arrived for the masquerade ball that had changed her life. But now she stood on the dais beside Edmund, wearing not a ball gown, but her wedding dress and a crown. The Queen's crown, smaller and more delicate than Edmund's, but no less significant. The weight of it on her head was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. They opened the dancing together, a waltz that Edmund led with practiced grace. As they moved across the floor, Arabella was intensely aware of all those eyes watching, all those minds calculating how this marriage would shift the power dynamics at court. "Stop thinking about them," Edmund murmured, pulling her closer than was strictly proper for a public dance. "This is our day, our moment. Let them watch and whisper. It doesn't matter." "It will matter tomorrow," Arabella pointed out. "Then we'll deal with it tomorrow. Tonight I just want to dance with my wife and remember how incredibly lucky I am that you said yes." The reception lasted for hours. Arabella danced with Edmund, with Prince Alexander, with various nobles who wanted to curry favor with the new queen. She smiled until her face ached, made polite conversation until her voice was hoarse, and navigated the treacherous waters of court politics with all the skill Margaret had taught her. But finally, mercifully, it was time to retire. Edmund led her from the ballroom amid knowing smiles and whispered comments. They made their way through the palace corridors toward the royal chambers, not the Queen's apartments where Arabella had been living, but Edmund's private rooms where they would spend their wedding night and every night thereafter. At the door, Edmund paused, turning to face her. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Arabella admitted. "Good. So am I." He kissed her softly, then opened the door and swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in a gesture that was both traditional and utterly romantic. The chambers were lit by hundreds of candles, their light painting everything in warm gold. The massive bed was covered in rose petals, the sheets turned down invitingly. Someone had left wine and delicacies on a side table, though Arabella doubted either of them would have any appetite for food. Edmund set her gently on her feet, then turned to lock the door. When he faced her again, something had shifted in his expression. The formal mask of kingship had fallen away completely, leaving only Edmund, the man who'd kissed her in a moonlit garden and changed her life forever. "I've been waiting for this moment for what feels like an eternity," he said, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. "The right to touch you, to love you, to show you exactly how much you mean to me." Arabella's heart was racing, desire and nervousness tangling together. I've never... I know." His hands came up to cup her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "We have all night, all our lives. There's no rush." He kissed her then, deep and slow and thorough, and Arabella felt her nervousness beginning to dissolve into something warmer, something that made her skin tingle and her breath come faster. His hands moved to the fastenings of her gown, fingers working with surprising dexterity to free her from the elaborate dress. "I've been fantasizing about this," Edmund murmured against her throat as the gown pooled at her feet. "Undressing you, seeing you, touching you without any barriers between us." Arabella's hands found the buttons of his uniform, fumbling slightly in her eagerness. I've been fantasizing too. About you. About this. About finally being able to touch you the way I've wanted to for weeks." They helped each other shed the layers of formal attire until they stood facing each other in only their undergarments, firelight and candlelight painting their skin in shades of gold. Edmund's eyes roamed over her with an appreciation that made Arabella feel beautiful and powerful and desired all at once. "You're extraordinary," he breathed. "How did I get so lucky?" "I think we're both lucky," Arabella replied, reaching up to run her fingers through his hair, dislodging the careful styling. "We found each other against all odds. That's not luck. That's destiny." "Then I'm grateful to destiny." He swept her into his arms again, carrying her to the bed, laying her down on rose petals and silk sheets. "And I intend to spend the rest of the night showing you exactly how grateful." What followed was tender and passionate, and occasionally awkward as they learned each other's bodies, learned what made the other gasp or moan or arch into touch. Edmund was patient and thorough, taking his time despite the urgency Arabella could feel in his trembling hands, making sure her pleasure came before his own. When they finally came together completely, Arabella felt something shift and settle deep in her soul. This wasn't just physical union. This was two people becoming one in all the ways that mattered. This was the completion of a journey that had started in a garden with a single kiss and would continue for the rest of their lives. Afterward, they lay tangled together, sweaty and sated and utterly content. Edmund's fingers traced lazy patterns on her skin, and Arabella felt herself drifting in that hazy space between waking and sleep. "I love you," Edmund murmured against her hair. "I don't think I've said it plainly enough. I love you, Arabella. Not because you're convenient or young or because you made me feel alive. I love you because you're brave and kind and stubborn and real, because you challenge me and support me and make me want to be better than I am." Arabella turned in his arms to face him, seeing the vulnerability in those storm-grey eyes. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since that first night in the garden, even though I knew it was insane. Even though everyone told me it was too fast, too impossible, my heart knew before my mind caught up." They kissed again, soft and sweet, sealing the words with touch. Outside, somewhere in the palace, the court was probably still celebrating or scheming or judging. Tomorrow they would return to the endless responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new enemies, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, in this room lit by candles and warmed by passion, there was only Edmund and Arabella. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and been brave enough to choose love despite every logical reason they shouldn't. It wasn't a fairy tale. Fairy tales were simple, neat, uncomplicated. This was messier, harder, more real, but it was also infinitely more precious because of that reality. As Arabella drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the terrified girl who'd walked into a masquerade ball hoping for magic. She'd found something so much better. She'd found truth, partnership, a love that didn't promise perfection but promised presence, a man who saw all her flaws and loved her anyway, a future that would be challenging and demanding and occasionally heartbreaking, but never, ever boring. She'd believed the kiss was from a prince, a golden boy from a storybook. Instead, she'd discovered it was from a king, a real man with real struggles and real depths. And that man had claimed her not as a subject or a convenience, but as his equal, his partner, his queen. Not the ending she'd expected, but the one she'd needed all along.